Welcome to A Photographer's Life, the channel that takes you behind the curtain into the world of professional architectural photography. Join us now for another episode with one of America's premier architectural photographers. Today's broadcast comes from a recent interview with award-winning American architectural photographer and writer, Caryn B. Today's interview was conducted by AIAP Director Alan Blakely. We hope you enjoy the show. If you do, please let us know by liking this episode and subscribing to this channel. Now, on with the show.
Today we're talking with Caryn B, and she is one of our top tier photographers and a well-known photographer throughout the U.S. And good morning, Caryn. We're grateful to have you with us, and thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Alan.
To start out with, I just wanted to maybe have you give us a little bit of a background about where did this all start, and how did you make your entry into photography?
Well, I worked in television. I had a whole other career in television and documentary television for about 20 years, but I always wanted to be a photographer, and I loved to travel. So I was a producer, writer, a camera person in documentary television, and worked in New York. But then I decided in my mid-30s I wanted to change careers to photography. But I also wanted to travel. So I took an overseas job on literally a flying eye hospital. I worked for a humanitarian organization called Orbis International, and they had a DC-10 airplane that had been converted into a hospital, and there was a television studio on the airplane where they broadcast the surgery live from one end of the plane to the other, so that the doctors in the third world countries we were visiting could sit in the first class section and watch the surgery live and learn and listen. We'd leave the teaching tapes. So on the weekends, I would travel the countries I was in, creating a portfolio, thinking I'm going to work for National Geographic.
Right, sure.
And then when I came back, well, of course that didn't happen. And I started teaching myself the business of photography by reading a lot on the internet and then filling in the gaps in my learning, the technical aspects, by taking 1-week workshops at Maine Photographic, Santa Fe, Palm Beach, and those places till I had enough of a skill set. But the architecture came later. And again, that was still through my love of traveling. So then when I would travel more on my own, I would find myself taking photographs of buildings all the time. And people would say to me, you need to take pictures of people, And I'm like, well, I don't know. Because I love architecture. I love how it informs us in so many ways. Like, if you visit Barcelona, we have Gaudi. So he's created a whole culture and a city based on his designs. Or you go into a coffee shop and the architecture it could be a funky vibe, and that creates another element. So it has history, it has artistry, it has all of the elements that I like. And it's fascinating to me. Especially, I've grown to really love more modern architecture of late, but I really love history. So I am attracted to the old buildings and the stories, who lived there, how did they build these things like Venice, all of that stuff. So that's how it happened. And I just kept taking pictures and had a portfolio of buildings.
That's a pretty common entry for a lot of people that I've talked to. They find themselves photographing buildings because that's what interests them, like you said there, and then they decide that they can make a living at it. At what point did you decide that you were going to concentrate on architecture? And now I know you do travel photography as well,
right?
And you've got books published and that sort of thing. We'll get into that later, but at what point did you consider yourself an architectural photographer? About how many years did that take to get to that point?
I think I'm still at that. I just this past summer, I don't know if you know who Scott Francis is.
I do.
Yes, he gave me a portfolio review. It was all through happenstance, and it was very, very valuable to me.
Okay.
And So I would say now I'm becoming an architectural photographer after his critique, which was brutal, but so honest and helpful. I'm still learning all the time. And what I'm really trying to do is constantly downsize my lighting, carrying all the lights on location and working on Photoshop, because I really like to shoot with natural light, but you absolutely have to light at times. So I feel like I'm always learning and evolving. And this past winter, I spent some time watching Mike Kelly. He's a architectural photographer out of LA. He's got a great series of videos. And, I picked up some new processing techniques in Photoshop. Still trying to work out luminosity masks. They just elude me, but it's
you, huh?
Yeah, and I keep trying. I'm like following along exactly, but
yeah.
I'm always learning, and that's one thing I like about it, because it's a very challenging field, technically, artistically, and mechanically too.
I think that's a good point to make, and I think that's something that people not in the field don't necessarily understand, is how technically difficult it is to get the kind of images that you get. Those don't come right out of the camera. And you talked about lighting. Your stuff does not look lit. I mean, it doesn't have that 70s or 80s look that we used to think of as when the lighting would be created by the photographer, not trying to capture the lighting that was in the space. But you're using lighting to control the scene. I mean, what you can actually capture on your camera, it sounds like. And the fact that you're continuing to evolve your process, I think, is interesting, because I don't know anybody working at the level that you work at that isn't doing that. And I think that would come also as a surprise to people, is that you don't get to a point where you've got it all figured out necessarily. There's always some new way to do things and some better way. Were you a film shooter at any point, or did you jump in? Okay.
And it kills me because when I told you about that trip I took, with Orbis, and I went to like 11 third world countries, all of that is on film.
Oh, okay.
In Cuba. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, amazing. And right after that, I transitioned into digital. So I just have those negatives sitting, and one of these days I hope I can do something with them.
Well, I can recommend a good scanner if you're interested.
All right.
Yeah. And that's a whole different world. So when you start down that rabbit hole as far as scanning and learning those techniques, when you jumped into digital, were you 35 millimeter format?
Yeah.
Okay. And what about lens choices? Do you have lenses that are your go-to lenses that you like, or?
Well, for architecture, I use the 24 millimeter tilt shift lens, and I add an extension onto it. So it makes it like a 35 millimeter if I need it.
Yeah.
And then I have, I think it's my 35 to 105.
Okay. Yeah.
And I do have the 70 to 200, but I rarely use it for architecture. And I was trying to learn this long exposure technique during COVID. So sometimes I use that lens a lot.
Okay.
Which is stacking filters, making 9 stop, 12 stops. And it's an interesting process. But those are the lenses I use.
Okay. Typically, we see people that are calling themselves architectural photographers, and everything's shot with a 17 millimeter lens.
Yeah.
Yours doesn't have that look. And
no.
In fact, it has a longer than normal lens look in a lot of situations, which is really so refreshing. And I think, at least to me, kind of speaks to an elevated level of skill and also artistry, that you see things in a way that it's taken some time to refine the way you see things. And you're based in Connecticut.
Right.
How wide ranging is your work these days?
Well, I go statewide, and I live kind of close to Rhode Island, so I do try to get down in that neck of the woods. So it hasn't really happened yet. And then,
Okay,
of course, I get work overseas sometimes. But
nice.
I generate a lot of that on my own,
Hmm.
because I'm also a writer, so I'm able to pitch complete stories.
Okay.
And sometimes when I come back from traveling, or sometimes when I'm there.
Okay. Now, as far as your mix of clients, can you give us an idea of who you do business with and kind of what the mix is for you?
It's mostly architects.
Okay.
Once in a while, it's a builder. Sometimes a company who fabricated a wall, let's say, in a school. I just had a job like that where they had
Mm.
fabricated a wall and they wanted me to take pictures of that. Sometimes I do that kind of stuff. I
Yeah.
did a senior center for a company recently, or over COVID last year, I should say, but mostly it's architects, and once in a while it's interior designers. And I branch out. I try. Oh, and also landscape designers. I get work with
Oh,
them,
interesting. Yeah.
and I am pushing that aspect because I just got commissioned to do a third book, and that's on gardens. And
Oh,
so I love photographing gardens because they're just beautiful. So I'm refining that skill set in my eye in that regard as well.
that seems like a tough one. I've done very little of that, but what I have done, it seems so tricky time of day wise.
Well, you got to get up early,
Yeah.
really early. But if you do, it's okay. And often, depending on the layout of the garden, you might have to go twice,
Yeah.
early morning and late day. But, I started the project late last summer after I got the contract. I had a job to Greenwich, Connecticut, which 95 is always so traffic ridden.
Mm.
So you have to factor that in. So I was leaving like at 3:30 in the morning to meet the sun at
Yeah.
5:30 or 6. Yeah, that was a bit
Get
early
that
for me.
that soft light. How do architects find you? Typically, do you find them or do they find you?
Well, a lot of them find me through your website,
Okay.
or ASMP, or I'm really good in the Google searches.
Oh,
I
that's
meta tag all my images, and I just spent, again, learning that recently again,
mm,
what Google likes, how many characters, etc. So I spent
mhm.
some time on my website revising all my headings to do that. And it's also word of mouth. I
Okay.
think the books have helped a lot because
Sure.
people seem to recognize my name now. And I've done a lot of TV interviews. I've had a lot of stuff published about the books in magazines and newspapers within the state, and did television
Mm,
and radio. So, and the books are out there as well.
yes.
So
Wow.
it's like brand recognition.
That's
Um,
huge.
and I write articles, as I said, but I try not to think too much about all that stuff. I'm grateful I can get paid to do what I love, really.
That's neat. How much writing are you doing? Is that a significant part of your work, or does it
Uh,
contribute to your photography?
um, Sometimes I write articles that I don't photograph,
Okay.
and sometimes I do both. And
Okay.
like I just published a story literally yesterday on Costa Rica, unique places to stay for Lonely Planet. So those were none of my images,
Oh.
but those were my words.
Hmm.
And then I write for a local magazine every month called Ink Magazine, and that I generate my own story ideas. Um, Rarely do assignments come to you. Actually,
Hmm.
it's usually me
You're
pitching.
pitching something.
Yeah,
Yeah, that makes
but
sense.
it's not. But depending on the magazine, the writing pays better sometimes than the photography, but it's so laborious. It just takes a long time. So by the
Yeah.
time you look at it hourly, you probably didn't do so well.
I think that's something that people think that's a romantic notion to be a writer, but
Yeah.
they don't understand just how much work that is, and
It is.
that it's really work that you have to do. That's amazing that you have that combination. That's a pretty valuable skill set to have. Let's talk about your working relationship with clients. When you when you get a new client, say somebody calls you and asks for you to photograph a project, or if you're interested in photographing, what's your process from there? Can you kind of just take us step by step as to how you approach a new assignment?
Well, they want a quote usually,
Yeah.
and I you really have to dig to find out what they want, because they're like, yeah, we need between 10 to 30 images, and I try to make them understand, okay, well, that's a huge range, and I need to get it down more so I know how long it's going to take the day you're shooting and then in post production. So I've
Right.
kind of revised it now. I used to charge hourly for post. Now I charge per image because it's just so much easier also with the client,
Hmm.
and the numbers are hard. This is what it's going to be. You want 30 images, and this is what it's going to be. So um, in my bid is a it's sort of like a contract at the same time. So it really lays out all the terms. If they take the time to read it, it's very informative. Like,
Hmm.
what is photo, how is something photo ready, and what happens if it isn't, and schedule delays and all these different things. But I don't know that anyone actually reads it. But one thing that I do is, to cover myself, is I always have this thing, by hiring Caryn B photography means you agree to these terms. So whether they sign them or not, it's in there. And I have revised and refined this every time a client has not, for lack of a better word, has not been above board in
Hmm.
what, and you can't even, I know you all know this, you can't even anticipate all the things that
No.
they're shocking sometimes. So
Yeah.
now it's all in there. And, but I like to, if they say, give me a call, I always call, because
Mhm.
I think personal is so much better. And I recently I had a new client who was a landscape architect, and this was a fluke, but they had a lot of bids that were very similar. The reason they went with me was they watched my TV interview about my book, and they saw
Oh,
my personality, and they thought I would fit in well with their office.
okay.
So I think anytime you can get on the phone with someone, they can hear your voice, you can establish that. That's really good. I
Mhm.
do follow up. A lot of people don't, but I do.
Yeah.
And I think that helps as well.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And a lot of times when I get an assignment and the client will tell me later, well, you're the only one who followed up with us.
Mm.
You're the only one who called back. And I find that just amazing that people would just wait for the client to call them. So,
Well,
uh,
I also believe in correct spelling and punctuation. It's just like saying please and thank you. And it really, in my opinion, it makes a difference. You want to present yourself as intelligent. And if you're already making mistakes in what you're writing, what kind of product are
mm,
you going to deliver? This is my philosophy. And
point.
I bend over backwards for my clients. I don't know. Some recognize it and appreciate it. Some are who they are too.
Well, what you said about seeing, how you fit with the company by talking with them on the phone, it probably also tells you whether this is somebody that you really want to work for or not.
Yeah.
Um, and do you ever pass on assignments?
I don't know. Once in a while I have,
Mm,
because the saying that, a good job gets better and a bad job gets worse, and you can tell.
mm.
There, like, currently there's this house I'm going to be photographing in April, and it's stunning.
Oh,
And I would have left this a long time before, but I really want it in my portfolio. So, um, and the person I'm doing it for is challenging and not with it, let's say, in the way that they should be.
okay.
But I finally did get my deposit out of them. So I'm like, okay. and they signed my contract. So there I am. But well, someone told me a long time ago about a pyramid, a triangle.
Mm-hmm.
And one is the money, one is the portfolio, and one is the client. And if you have all three in a job, it's great, but you should certainly get 2 out of the 3. And if you're only going to do it for one of those points, then you should be aware of why, whether you're just doing it for the money or the portfolio or to gain the client. So I kind of look at it like
excellent. I really like that. That's great. As far as your billing and collecting and things, you mentioned a deposit. Do you ask for a deposit on all assignments?
No, because I feel like it depends who it is. I'm a good judge of character. I've never been screwed, and if they're not messing around from the beginning and they're professional, then I usually don't.
Okay.
But I may now. One thing that drives me crazy, right? I just did a story for a magazine, Images and Words. And I just do not like chasing my money around. I'm like, I did the assignment, I submitted it on deadline. Now you just need to pay me, period. I have no tolerance for that. So when you have half their money up front, I think it helps with that. Absolutely. And again, we talked about before everybody came on about being a woman. I don't know if this extends to men, but I feel it seems like there's less regard for my gender in that way, where they seem like they think they can take a little bit more advantage. But I know everyone has that same problem.
I think it is a problem in general, but you're not the first woman I've heard that from. So, especially in photography, in the last meeting that's not yet online yet for the group, we talked about business practices and that sort of thing. And one photographer from Chicago mentions that he requires them to set up an account with a credit card at the outset, and that's how he's handling things. And that avoids all of those collection issues if that card is on file. And that's been something that I've been thinking about. I don't typically have any collection issues. And for those that I do, I don't work for them anymore. So.
Right. Yeah, that would, you asked that question before, that would be something that I would not take repeat business with if somebody was that delinquent.
Yeah. Outside of architects and interior designers and magazines, are there any other client segments that represent a significant portion of your work?
Sometimes builders, as I mentioned, stonemasons, believe it or not.
Oh, interesting.
Kitchen designers. I do have a regular kitchen designer client. Just trying to think what else. And landscape designers, as I mentioned as well.
Interesting. That's kind of a broad base to have for a photographer. And I think that helps those listening to this to maybe think outside of only working for architects or only working for interior designers. And
it's all design, though.
It is.
It really is.
It is. Let me ask you, getting back to your working process, I'm curious, when you're on set are you usually with a client or not? How does that work for you?
It really varies.
Okay.
And I shoot to an iPad using CamRanger. So if I'm with the client, I'm showing them and getting pre-approval on the angle. And I really love the iPad because, you can see, I don't like tangents in my images where things are going into something else and there's no break with the eye and negative space. So it's really, you can get in there really well and separate things. So it's all a mix. I just photographed at this. I worked for a lot of museums too, it seems.
Oh, okay.
And I was at the Hillstead Museum, I think it was last week, and we were shooting in there and using the iPad. And it was really helpful to say, can you move this a half an inch to the left?
Yeah. In one of our previous meetings, we found that most photographers in the AIAP, that is the process that they use. In fact, the vast majority are using the Cam Ranger with an iPad, which was interesting to me, and I hope it's interesting to Cam Ranger as well. But for me, that's what I do, and what I like about it is being able to hand the iPad to the client and let them walk through the set and see what the camera sees, because that's such a for a lot of clients that's so hard to visualize what the cameras actually see.
Right. Like in this case, there was a cabinet with china in it and lots of glare off the glass. So we, in the Cam Ranger, in the iPad, you can see it, and we know we have to block that. And so she hadn't noticed that with her own eye.
Oh.
But and they get into the process more, and they really enjoy it. She loved being able to see everything this way and move everything. And I think that's really good.
Yeah, I think if they feel a little bit more invested, then things always work out for the best. That's a great process. When you don't have a client there, you mentioned scouting and things like that. How much of your work do you actually scout ahead of time?
Well, my clients don't always like to pay for the scout. But I'm photographing this building, and it's nearby. So I went and scouted it complimentary because I know they're a good client. It's a beautiful new building, and I want the job, and I have the job, but I needed to see it. Yeah. And I want to give a shout out to Sun Surveyor because it was the first time I had it, and I never used it because I was using Light Tracker, and then I had to watch all the videos to learn it, and still something wasn't clicking for me. So I reached out to Adam, who designed the app, and he was so helpful. He took photos in his house to send to me to help illustrate the answers to my questions better.
Oh, wow.
And I thought that was really amazing customer service. So I told him I would mention it.
Well, that is my go-to app for trying to understand how to order my shots throughout the day, and looking at projects that I can't scout. That's the app that I use. Well, that's pretty much the only app that I use for that type of thing. And it's so nice to be able to have that confidence that you're going to be there at the right time, and that the light's going to be where it is. And it's an amazing app.
Yeah.
Hats off to you. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I recommended that actually in the last meeting that we had on Zoom, because it's just such a valuable piece of equipment for me anyway. Even though it's an app, it's right up there with all the other things that I use. So let me ask you about your deliverables. Do you show clients previews prior to taking things into post-production, or do you edit that yourself and send them? What's
it really depends. It depends on if they have to choose from, if we shot 20 and they only commissioned 10.
Okay.
And that's really tricky because they don't always visualize it. Just going back for 1 second, one of the reasons the iPad's so great is because they get to see how technically involved it is. And no, you can't just go in with an iPhone and go click and there you are. But people, sometimes the client gets nervous. I had this client get really nervous looking at my raw files because he couldn't visualize what it was going to be. So I always have to put, this has not been color corrected, straightened, highlights blown out, whatever, shadows, blah, blah, blah. So sometimes I show them that, but a lot of times I show them a near finished image edited, if like with the Hillstead, because they only commissioned 5 and they approved as we went. And then if they have any changes, I'll do it around to those and then give them a final.
Okay. And as far as your process goes, are you bracketing and then blending images together?
I bracket and then I do everything manually. I don't use HDR, except from watching one of your one of these recently.
Yeah.
Somebody mentioned the Easy HDR3.
hmm
So I've been looking into that, but I usually do manual compositing and then masking. And when I light paint, so I'll hit just different parts,
hmm
and then I'll bring that in as well. So I like to do a bracket with lights on, with lights off, and then light painting, and then use all different parts.
Okay.
And I really don't like shooting with lights at all on, but a lot of times, I have one client, he's an architect and he loves the lights because I find like they just make a mess on the wall. If they get really blown out. The highlights, what the eye sees is very different than what the camera sees. And I just like it better without it. So, but I have to do what they say.
I can relate to that. Yeah. I find that if I shoot for some lighting companies, and I find that sometimes they'll want them lit, of course, because that's what they're selling. But I may have a 10-second exposure for the shot, but the lights are only on for half a second.
Yes,
they're just flipped on and off just to give that bulb illumination, but not to mess with the walls, like you say, or the ceilings, or casting shadows from the structure of the light fixture and all that kind of stuff.
And you know what? I just learned that on Mike Kelly's video, and now I'm going to write it down because I already forgot it. You see, it just comes and goes so fast.
That's back from the film days. Is when I learned that. Is trying to get everything on a single sheet of film.
Right.
With multiple exposures with filter packs for different light sources and different intensities. And I don't miss that at all.
Yeah.
So that's
I can't imagine how they did it in the days where all you had was a Polaroid to look at.
We just didn't do it very fast. So a shot takes, 2 hours if we're going to do a shot. And then you'd have those hard costs for Polaroid and film and processing that went along with it. So, and the nice thing is that all you had to do was drop it off at the lab and then pick it up the next morning.
Right.
And give the client the correct exposure. So, it's different. So it sounds like you do your own processing then.
Yeah. You know what? I can't give it up. I just, maybe if I could hire somebody who did it the way I wanted it done or instructed, I just feel like that's really where it all comes together, and why my images look the way they do. Although I do send out for major retouch at times, if they want something huge removed, or I just started using, I'm looking at it here, Luminar. So sometimes, that helps to add a sky if I need it.
Sure.
But again, I'm always really careful because I want it to look real. I don't want things so over processed that it takes the soul out of what you're shooting. And I don't mean to sound esoteric in that way, but for me, that's what the difference is in the aesthetic that I like. I want it to look real, and I don't like every imperfection taken out. And it's a fine line because, the architect's selling his architecture, or the floor guy's selling the floors, and the patina's a little off, or the color, on this window is a little different than that window, but that's how it looked. So, and that's how it would look if you were in the room. So it's a fine line between over polishing, in my opinion.
I think you're right. And I know you're right. And I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's something I think that's really difficult for us as photographers to navigate, is how much we do to an image, in an effort to please the client, and but also at the same time trying to have some integrity in the image. Just the fact that what the space actually looks like.
Right.
I've got some clients who expect to have all the light switches, all the outlets, all the fire alarms, everything taken out, all the exit signs. And I do send that kind of work out because that's just tedium. And I understand that in major retouching, but I'm like you. I like to process my own because I think it harkens back to you know the whole darkroom aesthetic and the fact that
Mm,
the same negative can look vastly different
yeah,
in the hands of different photographers.
right.
So
And
I
I guess
appreciate that.
in the end, what we're selling is our own aesthetic of things. And
Sure.
as digital image makers, it's not just how you take a picture anymore; it's also how you edit it. You know.
Exactly. Yeah. That is such an important point. Thank you. One of the things I think that's hard for people to understand who are not in the business is the fact that the equipment we use is pretty insignificant in you know the end result. Not totally insignificant, but you can get a photograph that looks like a Karen Davis photograph with a lot of different kinds of cameras and lenses.
Mhm.
The person behind that camera who makes that photograph look the way it does. And so,
Yeah.
uh,
I think that the one thing that you either have or you don't, I don't think it can be taught is composition. You know,
yeah,
you either have it or you don't, and that's the difference. And then you can develop the aesthetic because I've seen how my eye has changed, but technical can be taught. I don't think composition can necessarily be taught. It can be to a degree, like I was talking about tangents, move this,
mhm,
move that, but the initial when you I find when I take a series of photographs, the first one is usually the best because it was my first instinct. I walked in and I went, oh, there it is. You
that's
know,
interesting. Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that as far as my work goes. Um, it's the way you see things personally
yeah,
that your client is paying for, and um, that's interesting that you mentioned that's something that can't be taught. I used to try to teach to architectural workshops in Santa Fe,
oh,
and that was the hardest thing for me. Is I could tell them all the nuts and bolts of it, but I couldn't in any way communicate where to stand and where to put the camera and what lens to put on it and how to frame it.
right,
There weren't any parameters for teaching that. If you didn't see it, you just didn't see it. So
yeah, and
that's interesting.
I'm always looking too. Even when I travel, sometimes I don't. I'm not always. I'm looking with my eyes. I want to experience. So sometimes the camera stays in the bag. Um, and I'm looking at the light and the shapes and the contrast and all the time, everywhere I go. It's just what I do.
Um, don't you think that informs the way you make photographs later on, though? The fact that
Yeah,
you're aware of all those elements.
yeah. And you have to enjoy too. You have to experience. You can't just live your life behind the camera.
Do you take a camera when you go on vacation for leisure purposes, or
Yeah, but I'm going to Spain
okay,
very soon, and I'm definitely taking my camera,
okay,
especially when I go to Barcelona.
oh, well, yeah, absolutely. Um, let's talk. We touched on this just briefly, but well, let me give you some background first. When I first started in this business in the 1980s, uh, the top photographers in the country, architectural photographers, were women. Not all, but they were a very high percentage. There were some women that I just really looked up to as far as the way they shot, and technically, their work was just absolutely amazing. When film kind of died out, that ratio in the market changed pretty dramatically, and I'm not really sure what happened there. I don't know if these ladies didn't transition into digital or what happened there. But now, people like yourself are kind of in the minority as far as architectural photography goes. Now, that's not the case in other areas of photography by any means. I would say in the market, and I know from the Photo Marketing Association statistics from last year that women dominate the professional photography market. So that's a given. But in our particular discipline, I find it interesting that the things have kind of gone upside down from where they used to be. You mentioned, just kind of working relationships and things like that. But what are some of the challenges that you face that you think might be unique, or are there any?
Well, I definitely think that we don't get paid as much. I mean, of course, I can say whatever I want for money, but I feel there's still a barrier there in what people are willing to pay a man versus a woman, or what they think a woman's worth is in the
Okay.
same field. And I know, no, this is just my opinion. I don't
Yeah.
want to get too big.
No, that's why we're here, is for you.
People getting, upset with me and saying that's not true or
Yeah,
whatever.
they won't.
And also, I feel like I get asked to do things I really don't think they would ask men to do. Like, I had this client, and I look back on my records. I have been soliciting him since 2014.
Okay.
And finally he has a job, let's say, but it's really just a carrot. In reality, what he wants me to do, as it turned out, was to drive an hour and a half each way to where he is, where he has a store set up, and give my advice to him for free on the best way to photograph his products, like technically and artistically, and maybe talk about a job he has down the line.
Oh boy.
Which is the carrot to get me down there for free. And I thought, this is insane. And I really don't think he would have asked a man to, or expected that from a man, or had the gall.
Yeah.
So I kind of said, wow, that sounds like you need a consultation. And I told him the rate, and I never even got the courtesy of a reply after talking to him on the phone and email, going back and forth for scheduling. And so that's someone I probably wouldn't work with, going back to that conversation, because it was just plain rude. He could say thank you, but no thank you. So that kind of stuff, where I know that people always think photographers, this drives me crazy. Oh, we'll give you photo credit. It's like, what do you do? Give me money. I don't need the photo credit. So I kind of think that translates in my industry with women. But on the other hand, I did get a job because I was a woman, because the company felt that they wanted that aesthetic, and it was different than the male aesthetic they had been getting. So I don't know, but it's happening really intensely in the film industry too, where women directors before talkies were at the top of the heap.
Right.
And now they're not. And only one woman director has won in the near 100-year history of the Oscars. But there's a great documentary out called I'm spacing out on it. It's on Netflix right now about it. And it's just fascinating. And it's similar, in a way to our industry.
You mentioned about the aesthetic that you could bring to the job. And I'm just wondering, in a situation, say, where you are working with interior designers, is it any different in that situation? Because that's a female dominated industry. I mean, is there any difference there?
I find them to be very tough clients, because they're always moving things around after everything's set up. Like, there's never the point where they stop and you're like, okay, I need to take the picture now. This is what we agreed on. And then you take the picture, you go through all your brackets, they come in and they move something again, and you have to start over. I find them not as professional or as decisive in certain ways. I think that's an oversaturated field where they decide, now that they finished doing whatever they did before, I'm going to become an interior designer. And I feel like there's a little bit of a lack of professionalism. I hate to disparage, or put down any industry like this, but that's just been my experience. So that's a tough question to answer.
Yeah, my experience is similar, except with those that are at say at the top of the industry.
Yes, of course.
And then they seem to understand what it is I do, and they respect that.
Right.
My wife, who's passed through this frame a couple times, is my business partner and travels with me as a set stylist.
That's great.
And she has a fairly high level of frustration with that kind of thing, because we'll get it set so that it's ready for the camera, and a client off axis 30 or 40 degrees sees something and wants to change it based on where they are, not where the camera is. So that's kind of interesting. But I'm wondering too, one of the things that I find that's a little difficult is in working with construction companies and really big firms, where the marketing directors are typically always female, and they're typically in their 20s and 30s. And
yes.
For me, a photographer in his 60s, that's not always a good. It's not an easy mix, and so my wife helps soften that situation quite a lot by being along with me. But do you run into any challenges, let's say, with the people who are coming into the architecture and engineering and construction industry, who are young, very young, inexperienced marketing directors?
Yeah, I don't really understand how they got the job, but they're very inexperienced, and it's really hard to work with them. And when you're on location and they're just on their phone, and so perhaps you didn't. This happened to me. I didn't get an angle that maybe had they been art directing as they should have been. And then later their boss was like, well, what about that angle? And I said, well, I set it up, I got this, and she signed off on it.
Yeah.
But it still reflects on me in the end, I feel.
Yeah.
So and I also, anybody that, and again, this goes back to my old school grammar. If you're going to start a sentence with, hey, Caryn, in your email, I know already. And I actually will go to LinkedIn to try and find their photograph. Okay. So I know what their age is and what I'm dealing with, and I can see their level of experience, and that informs me about how to talk, how much, I know they're not going to really read what I'm writing. So how can I say it as succinctly as possible to cover my ass, let's say?
Yeah.
So, that's what I try to do. I also like, as I said, I like to read faces. There was an art director I wanted to solicit recently, and she had this scowl on LinkedIn. I thought, oh my gosh, she's probably never even going to read my email. Why would you put a face like that on there? I don't know. But anyway, so that's what I do. I try to get as much information as possible. And that's not to say that not all young people are sharp. Mm-hmm. I've seen this company, I can't remember their name, they're in Brooklyn, and their architecture is amazing. And they're probably late, early, probably in their 30s.
Okay.
And their work's beautiful. So I think it's whoever it is, really.
Yeah. Yeah. You bring up an interesting point about kind of vetting the client ahead of time and doing a little bit of research on that. I think that's such an important thing. And I don't think many photographers do that. I mean, do a little bit of research. I've only done it just in recent years, and LinkedIn seems to be the go-to to find out about the client. And you can tell pretty quickly based on their website and the people that are working for them if it's going to be a good fit for you.
Even when I'm looking for companies to solicit, like I was driving around recently and I saw an interior design studio. I thought, oh, wow. So I looked them up online and I saw the pictures and I thought they're never going to hire me because they're just using iPhone photos. They don't care about
Yeah.
anything better. They really wouldn't understand. And then if I told them my price, they would just think it was outrageous. So I do that as well. I look at websites and sometimes I don't bother. And interestingly enough, I find a lot of architects who have beautiful work often are posting blurry images on their website. And
Yeah.
I don't really understand if their graphics person isn't making the translation well or what's going on there. But I think that presents very unprofessional, and I'm surprised they let that go.
Yeah, I see that a lot as well. And I think what happens a lot of times is that they've got a person that's putting things together for them on the website who's viewing it on a laptop. And then, you look at it on your 27-inch monitor and it's all pixelated and it doesn't seem to matter what size file you give them.
Right.
They'll use something that's not proper resolution. And so there's a little bit of hand holding there that sometimes has to take place, I think, to bring it up. I mean, it's not been that long really that architects even were on board with having a website. And construction companies are kind of still lagging behind on that. And the interior designers are probably less concerned. Is there one place that you mentioned LinkedIn? Do you post much social media, or is there one social media outlet you use more than another?
I post on social media begrudgingly. I really, it's a lot of work. But I do it, and I post to LinkedIn and Instagram mostly.
Okay.
I post Facebook through Instagram. I rarely even look at Facebook, truthfully. But I think Instagram is really important, and LinkedIn is as well. Although LinkedIn now I think is changing because of what's going on with Facebook, and it's becoming more like the bathroom wall and less professional from what I've been reading. So, but you have to do it. You have to have a social media presence, and sometimes they want to see that over your website.
Yeah, especially if it's someone younger that's thinking about hiring you, they'll probably go there before they'll go to your website, which is kind of fascinating. But I agree with what you say. Do you do your own social media then?
I do. I paid someone a lot of money once, 2 years ago. And from what I've read, if you're not constantly on Instagram doing stories, reels, postings, commentings, etc. all day, your stuff is going to get buried. So all I can do is just put my best effort forward. I try to post 2 a week. I use Hootsuite. If people don't know about that, because you can post to more than one stream at a time, and it's free up to 3, which is what I have. But and also because if I had to hire someone, I'd have to tell them my hashtags, because sometimes I never know what I'm going to do. So I just posted Hillstead this morning. So I'm writing, Colonial Revival, Historic Home, Claude Monet, because there's paintings of his in there, Canopy Bed, red. I'm trying to think really out of the box because Canopy Bed was red and not just the typical. And then visit, because they're a museum, visit Connecticut, tourism, blah, blah, blah. So if I had to write all that down, I might as well do it myself.
Might as well. Yeah. I agree. I use Hootsuite as well. That is such a time saver to be able to not only be able to do more than one account at a time, but be able to do a series of posts, 2 or 3 at a time throughout the week. So that's a huge time saver. Have you ever had employees or assistants? Do you use assistants?
I use assistants sometimes on location.
Okay.
And I hire someone to do, I don't like marketing. So I hire someone to sit here and make the calls for new business. And usually she's so good. Usually, she gets a job for me out of it.
Oh, okay.
And sometimes I cold call, but I don't think it goes as well because I think it makes you look better if someone else is doing that for you, calling on
I
your
agree.
behalf. But
Yeah.
now she, unfortunately, she took a full-time
Oh,
job,
no.
so I have to find someone else. But I'm happy to pay for it. I find it laborious, you know.
Do people that just find you organically say, is it through your website, do you think, or is it through your
It's
books?
usually through Google search.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and again, your website, and
Mhm.
once in a while, ASMP.
Okay. Image licensing is the last thing that I wanted to cover with
Mm.
you before we wrap up here. And I just wondered, how do you handle your licensing? Do you allow cost sharing with licensing and things like that? What's that
I
look like for
do.
you?
And I'm a real stickler about this. It's really hard to navigate because I'm reading about a lot about the social media bit and trying to decide how I want to handle that because you
Mhm.
do a shoot for one client, like I did a shoot for a client who makes pillows, let's say, and
Mhm.
then they share it with the fabric person, with the person who made the chair, and blah, blah, blah. Sometimes it benefits you the more people see your stuff, but other times they're just getting free content and advertising off your back and you're getting nothing.
Mhm.
So that aspect I'm still trying to decide. Sometimes I grant the rights for that and sometimes I don't. I never grant third party without them paying me.
Mhm.
But in that I build into cost sharing and tack on a percentage of the entire
Mhm.
bill.
Yeah.
I also subscribe to Pixie, which
Okay.
if you're an ASMP member, you get a discount. And I have found so many images of mine being illegally used. And right now I have a suit that's happening because and gratefully, like I don't copyright everything, but my book's been copyrighted and they've been using images from my book. And it's so great because my book's copyrighted. So, and I've that kind of stuff blows me out. I really don't like when people steal from me. So, but when you subscribe to Pixie, you're going to see your stuff everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
disturbing.
AIAP offers the same discount that ASMP does on that.
Great.
They offer that, I think, to most photography organizations. And so, and like you, I jumped into that and I've got 395 cases currently in process with Pixie. So
Wow. But
it's
I will say,
yeah,
sorry.
it's become a new income stream, basically.
Yes, yes. And I will say though about the licensing, I work for smaller clients.
Hmm.
It's not like usually the Sheridan or a big chain. Let's say they're local architects, and I don't like to nickel and dime them, and they don't like to be nickel and dime. So I usually grant them the rights in all media,
Uh-huh.
and I usually hold back on magazines and books because I know that magazines pay stock photography, and I also don't want the magazine absorbing my image in their database and not knowing who photographed it and
Right.
winding up everywhere, which I also find a lot. So
Yeah.
that's the line that I usually draw.
I think that's
tough.
an important point, and I hope people don't just skip over that because that's such an important point that you made there, and it's one that gets missed by most photographers.
Yeah.
And what happens with most magazines is that metadata is stripped out.
Yes.
Any publication like that, and so once it's in their database, it's reassigned a new file number, and there's no association with photographer after that point. So
Hmm.
it's gone forever, unless Pixie goes after it, I guess.
Right.
On average, do most of your jobs include some type of multi-party licensing, or
Not always.
okay,
Um, I'd say half and half.
okay?
Yeah, and that it's always nice when you can do that.
And do you bring that up to the client up front when you make the quotation, or when? How does
Well,
that
it's in that
arise?
contract under, copyright and licensing, and it
Mhm.
says no third parties, blah blah blah. Without a license, you can always add this amount onto Bill,
Okay.
but this building I'm going to be shooting hopefully next week, there is an architect and interior designer attached to it. So I did mention that up front to them as a way to save some money on the whole thing.
Hmm.
And this, I'm shooting it for the company who had the building built.
Okay.
But I hope the architect likes the images because she lives around the corner and I've been wanting to work with her for a while.
That's great. Well, I appreciate all the insights that you've given in such a short
Thanks.
amount of time. For those who are going to be watching this later, I I would imagine they'll be taking notes because you touched on so many important and valuable things that you just don't learn unless you're in this business. And
It's true.
you've been very generous in sharing those through this interview today.
Thanks. I really
I
appreciate
appreciate it.
you having me here. It's an honor, really.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. We're really honored to have you as a member of the AIAP, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Okay, great.
Thanks
Thank
again,
you
Caryn.
so much, Alan. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This has been another episode of A Photographer's Life. If you've enjoyed this program, please let us know by liking this episode and subscribing to this channel. A Photographer's Life is brought to you by the Association of Independent Architectural Photographers. This episode is copyrighted and may not be used in full or in part without the written permission of the AIAP. Please join us again soon for another inside look at the world of professional architectural photography.